Go. All right, welcome back to part 2 of transition in the IEP. We're going to just jump right in where we left off last week. And this was the slide I left you with. And we had talked a little bit about literacy, basic literacy to be employable according to the Workforce Innovation and Education Act is 8th grade literacy and numeracy. Then we talked about how health literacy, you have to be at a 10th grade reading level to access most print content that you get at your doctor's office or anything on the website. And then we talked about all these aspects of health literacy. But then I wanted to add these other slides, which I usually include in my my medical transition presentation, just as a reminder, if your child has a brain-based disability, epilepsy surgery, et cetera, there might be other things that they need to know that are well beyond a 10th grade reading level, right? And sometimes what I find in our community is sometimes the parents don't even know the answers to some of these questions, like what is the underlying condition that caused a child seizures, or what type of surgery did you have, right? So right now I'm working on writing up a one-pager for my son. I thought I had it, but I went and looked at it and it wasn't very good. So I'm going to redo it and just make sure it's really clear that all of this is spelled out so that he doesn't have to know it, but can have access to it. So this is some other literacy. And then let's go really deep into the medical literacy. And the reason I include this slide when I do the health transition, which I will do a webinar later this year on this, the doctors, this is how they speak. So when your adult child goes into the doctor and they say cerebrospinal fluid or refractory or congenital or sagittal sinus, and your child doesn't know what that means, at the very least, they need to be taught the self-advocacy skills to say, I don't understand this. Can you please speak to me in plain language? Can you give me a written summary at the end of today's meeting? Or a reminder that they can bring someone into all these medical appointments with them. They could have someone on the phone, et cetera. I've been helping my mom who has dementia, and doctors are very accommodating when they understand that there is a need for that level of support. All right, let's just do a quick overview of students with severe and multiple disabilities. Students with more significant disabilities, more complex disabilities, multiple disabilities, they are also entitled to a thorough transition assessment. So like I said before, there's nothing in the law that says only these kids get X, right? So oftentimes children with severe and multiple disabilities or more complex presentations, I hear things from teams like, well, they're never going to work. Well, they're never going to do this. Well, they're never going to do that. So on one hand, that's not necessarily true, but maybe you're looking at slightly different things than you would with a child that had a less severe disability, but you're still required, the school is still required to assess in the areas of education and training, employment, and independent living skills. And that transition assessment is required. The transition assessments are what we use to help to develop the measurable post-secondary goals, identify the necessary transition services, and evaluate the outcomes of these services, right? So if we don't do assessment, we don't even know if the intervention that they're offering is working. At transition age, as a reminder, age-appropriate transition assessment is required annually, not every 3 years, but every year. So when you look at a child with a severe and multiple disability, there might be different approaches used. It's really important to assess the transition-related strengths and needs of students with severe disabilities from multiple perspectives, because a single informant may provide an incomplete view. So for example, if you talk to the vision teacher about a child who has multiple disabilities, they're maybe only going to comment on what they can comment on from that perspective. The parent is going to have a very different perspective than the classroom teacher. The neuropsychologist is going to have a very different perspective than the psychologist or social worker, et cetera. So really using person-centered or family-centered planning is important. What is the vision that the student and their family has for the future, and how do we determine their preferences, interests, and strengths, which is what IDEA says is required for all students. So you're going to look at things like their communication skills. They might need access to nonverbal assessments. They might need information provided from others, like commentary and observation. What academic skills do they have, or do they still need to work on? What are their life skills and their functional and adaptive skills? Do they have sensory needs? And then just going through, everything, physical mobility, medical and health. What are their leisure and social skills? I've talked about this in the previous session, and this is such an important piece to me, that only 1/3 of adults with severe and multiple disabilities have a friend or a social interaction at least once a week in adulthood. That's based on the literature. That's really tragic to me. So what is the leisure and social activity that you envision for your young adult, and what skills do they have? What do we need to build on to get them so they can be in a community environment and have that social piece in adulthood? What is their behavior, and how is that going to impact their access to settings in adulthood across their lifetime? What assistive technology do they need or could be helpful for them to access or improve behavior, function, et cetera? What is their eligibility for adult services, and what are the adult services? Really, really important regardless of the level of impairment. That transition readiness, that vocational evaluation, self-determination, all of that is very important to tease out. We want to look at situational assessments as well, and it might not be looking at it for a career placement, but for what's the appropriate adult setting that they're going to be in. I talked before about a child with misophonia that was had Starbucks listed as their measurable post-secondary goal for employment, and after a few minutes at the Starbucks for a test run, he was unable to function in that environment and had to leave. So you might have your heart set on a particular adult day program for an individual with more severe needs, but then go there and realize that it really isn't the right setting. So rather than waiting on a waiting list for many years for a program that's inappropriate, how do we determine what settings would be appropriate? Maybe you need to do situational assessments in different settings. And the assessment tools might look different as well. And you have the slide deck now, everyone who registered for this. So you have the list of the vocational assessment tools that are used. Here's a list of some assessments that might be used for individuals with severe and multiple disabilities. Some of them are picture-based, some are checklists, some are reports from a teacher, behavior scales, et cetera. Not one of these alone is not an assessment. Remember, a checklist is not an assessment, a questionnaire is not an assessment, but when you combine these measures with observation and feedback from the team, that can comprise an assessment for a student who's unable to participate as fully in their own assessment, and it is required by law. So for all students, regardless of their disability, transition assessment has to include everything that is required in any assessment in the law. So if you look at the language of the law, under transition assessment, there's no definition of transition assessment, but IDEA does include a definition of assessment. So assessment under the law has to include things like formal and informal measures. So that's standardized tests, IQ tests, et cetera. And then the informal tests might be those interest inventories, observational reports, rating scales, or checklists. There have to be clear measurements of the level of support that the individual needs during the assessment process. It has to include those transition planning inventories and assessments. The student, parent, and schools should be interviewed. There should be questionnaires. They have to be part of the evaluation process. There need to be functional measures of the student performance and behavior. So what are their adaptive skills? What is their mobility like? What are their physical and functional ADLs? This might include a functional vocational evaluation. And then again, those situational assessments where you're actually observing the child in a real life setting, not just in a quiet room one-on-one, because that doesn't give you very much information. And also, at the end of the day, what is key, recommendations on how to assist the student in meeting their stated post-secondary goals. They are required under the ethical obligations of the National Association of School Psychologists, for example. Most of the licensing boards of each related service provider has a description of what an assessment needs to include. So go look it up for your state and see what the requirements are. So for NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists, recommendations are required. So when you get to the end of that report and it says recommendations the IEP team will discuss and decide, that's not okay, right? You need the expert who's just evaluated your child to opine as to the appropriate interventions, placement, accommodations, whatever it is that the student needs. And all of the assessments should be done with accommodations, especially assistive technology. So if the student uses accommodations in their daily life, they should be used in the assessment process as well as appropriate. Here are just some more descriptions of what the law says are required for any assessment, a variety of tools and strategies. How does the child how is the child involved in the gen ed curriculum? We have to be looking at that. Where are they in comparison to their peers, and how are they accessing that curriculum? You can't use one measure or assessment as the only data point. And any instruments they use or measures or test tools have to be technically sound. They have to be researched and valid. And in our case, for kids who've had brain surgery for epilepsy, they have to look at a combination of the cognitive, behavioral, and developmental factors. And if your child's out of school and you're looking at getting assessments through your state Department of Rehabilitation or vocational rehabilitation or another agency, I would consider all of these things in the same light, and push for the most robust assessment possible. It's the most important part of the process. And then the law says all of these areas are required for assessment, and that is no different with transition assessment. In the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through this, but you have this information in your slide deck. At the very end of the day, there has to be a summary of findings at the end of each report that includes how the rate of progress and how will that impact their future learning. Right? What are their unique needs? You have to formally assess a specific area of concern. So if the parent says to the evaluator, I'm really concerned that my son doesn't have the social skills or the behavioral skills to function in an adult environment, and that isn't addressed at all in the evaluation, they didn't formally assess a specific area of concern. So that might gain you an independent educational evaluation at district expense, which I'll discuss in a minute. You have to look at both academic achievement and functional performance. I talked about this last week, where at high school age, I sometimes see teams, well, now we're going to put this student in a life skills class and we're not teaching any reading anymore, even though the child has made progress in literacy but isn't at grade level. And why? The law says academic and functional all the way through transition age. So if the child continues to need academic literacy or numeracy instruction, that should be provided. What are the ongoing needs, goals, services, methods of measuring progress? All of that should be part of those recommendations. What type of instruction do they need? How much? In what setting? What related services do they need? What community experiences do they need? What are the employment and other post-school living objectives that they're going to be working towards? And that's going to help define what services, settings, training, et cetera, are going to be provided. So the evaluators should be done by administered by trained and knowledgeable personnel. That's what the law says. So don't be afraid to ask your IEP team, what is the knowledge, experience, and training each evaluator has in transition assessment, and what knowledge they have of your child's disability combined with their neurological, social, emotional, medical, or other needs. So I have seen evaluations done by school teams, and then I've asked, and they were terrible. And then I've asked the evaluator at the IEP meeting, which was the first interaction I had with that person. So how many transition assessments have you done? Sometimes they've done 5 or none, right? Sometimes they've done hundreds. Okay, great. You've done hundreds of transition assessments. How many transition assessments have you done on a child who has had half of their brain removed? None, right? How many assessments have you done on a child who's had laser ablation? They're like glazed over. They don't even know what a laser ablation is because they don't have that knowledge. So if they're not working collaboratively with someone who does have that knowledge, or they don't personally have that knowledge, again, that might warrant an IEE. So the evaluations are generally conducted by a team when you're at transition age. I really like to time the transition assessment with a triennial as much as possible. So you're going to have your whole team doing the evaluation, ideally led by the school psychologist or a vocational specialist. A neuropsychologist is still critically important at transition age. Again, they're really going to be offering those meaningful insights at transition age, looking at social function, adaptive skills. The school will not have a neuropsychologist on staff, but they must provide this evaluation if it is requested and it's based on the needs of the child. The functional vocational evaluations, some districts will employ a vocational evaluator, a certified vocational evaluator, but some don't, in which case you might be needing to use that IEE, which I'll discuss in a minute. And then the related service providers will do their own evaluations. They can provide meaningful input into the child's skills and function, but like the occupational therapist is not doing the transition assessment. I've seen this happen where there was the school counselor did a career interest inventory, and then the OT did their evaluation, and they called that the transition assessment. So you have to think about the level of complexity of your child. Remember, assessment, the law says that assessment has to be comprehensive enough to consider all areas of suspected disability. And at transition age, we're now looking at what are they doing when they leave school, and the assessment has to be considering the path to get there. So it's very, very different at transition age. If you disagree with the evaluation, here's the independent educational evaluation, or IEE. If the assessment isn't comprehensive, it's not valid. That might warrant an IEE. This is at district expense. When you request an IEE, the district has two possible responses. It's fund or file. So they either say, yeah, we'll pay for your independent evaluation, or they have to file due process against you, take you in front of a hearing officer to say our evaluation was comprehensive and therefore it's valid and we're not going to pay for this. I used to say I never see this happen, very, very rarely, but more and more districts are starting to push back. So if you do decide to request an independent educational evaluation, I suggest that you call a local advocacy agency and a special education advocate or a special education attorney, just to run it by them first before you submit that request. And that's where you can get your functional vocational evaluation. All right, so it took us this long just to get through the first part, understanding what transition is, getting to the assessments. It's so important that you treat that part of the process as the lengthiest part, right? The assessments are the bread and butter. You cannot build an IEP without robust assessments. So that's why it takes so long to get here. Now, in the transition meeting, we're going to identify the transition service needs of the student, but not really. We've already identified them with the assessment, right? So this is where we come together to discuss the needs of the student based on those assessments. And I, again, like to tie this with an annual or with a triennial as often as possible. But remember that the transition IEP is required to be in place federally by age 16. In some states, it's age 14 or even 12. So look up your state statute and find out when they're required. And again, if your team agrees that they are willing to do the transition process earlier, then that's the timeline they're on. So for my son, we started at age 13. So we had to have that transition plan in place, basically within about 8 weeks of when we agreed that we were starting that process. Who attends the meeting? The difference at transition age is the student is at the center of the IEP process. They must be invited to participate in the IEP. If they can't attend in person, they're not willing to, they don't want to, they're afraid to, whatever, their input needs to be collected in advance of the meeting, or they can provide a video, they can do a PowerPoint, they can do an interpretive dance, whatever it is, but they need to be giving their input to the team. As much as possible, if you can start getting your student to practice attending IEP meetings leading up to transition age, in a perfect world, the student should be running their own IEP meeting at the end, right? In a dream world. Doesn't always happen, but you want to be building up to them being more and more involved and understanding that this is not an IEP that's about them, but it is for them, it is with them. It is a collaborative tool to help them reach their life goals. The other changes at transition age is, always need the parents and caregiver, the regular education teacher, the special ed teacher, someone to interpret the education results, a person of knowledge or special expertise about the child. That can include related service personnel or anyone you want to bring from outside that you want to bring, and then the district representative able to commit resources. But now at transition age, the outside agency representatives must be invited. The school district is responsible for this. They often don't do this well, so you will need to tease out who are the outside agencies that we want involved in this process and start to invite them. So in California, it would be our regional center, which is a state agency that supports our home and community-based service waiver for adults who are SSI recipients, but in California, it starts much younger. Our Department of Rehabilitation, which would be your state vocational rehabilitation department. In my son's case, he worked with Lighthouse for the Blind, so they were invited. He had independent living skills provider, so that person was invited, a private psychologist perhaps that would be working with him through adulthood, et cetera. Any transition specialists that are either in the district or that are contracted with the district. And really you want to make sure you have people there who know the student well and believe in his or her potential. So if you have a team, an IEP team that is like, well, I don't really know what this kid's going to be able to do, we're wasting our time here, whatever, make sure you pack that room with people that are like, no, we know what this kid can do. We know what they're capable of. And it might not be success in your eyes, but we are seeing this child make progress and we see what he's going to be able to do in adulthood. Make sure those people fill the room. Now that that's happened, the assessments are done, you've gotten to the IEP meeting with the right people, now you're going to start to develop transition goals based on the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, which were written by that IEP team based on all of those assessments. That's how the team develops goals and objectives that considers the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. There are two types of goals at transition age. There are measurable post-secondary goals in education, employment, and independent living. These are statements of what the student will do after graduation, not what they will achieve while they're still in high school. And then annual goals, which focus on the skills that will allow the student to meet their identified post-secondary goals. Very important. So post-secondary goals are not to be confused with the annual IEP goals. What I see in post-secondary goals is they're often statements. It's like, Bennett will go to college to study environmental studies. Bennett will work at Lighthouse for the Blind summer camp. Bennett will live independently in an apartment with roommates and support staff, right? Whatever it is, it's a statement. That's not a goal. It should be, the law says measurable post-secondary goals, but honestly, I've never seen it written that way in any IEP. But it's really important that you then step back and you look at what is the annual goal that is supporting each and every one of those measurable post-secondary goals, right? Very, very important. Without the measurable post-secondary goals, though, the team won't know what to work towards. Without a target, it becomes very difficult to fulfill the criteria for transition planning. So it's still really important to have those statements of what the student wants to do after high school or intends to do, or the family's vision of what the child will do. But the only accountability you have is in the annual goals. So the annual goals have to be written in such a way that they're going to ensure that the child is making progress short-term towards their annual goals. I hope that makes sense. Post-secondary goals have to be made in education and training, employment, and where appropriate, independent living. Education and training are often lumped together. I very rarely see those two categories broken out in IEPs. So that's okay. What is the education and or training they will be doing after high school? And then what will their employment and independent living? Some teams presume that goals in this area and independent living are only for students with intellectual disabilities or significant or multiple disabilities or autism or something like that. But many students have difficulty with independent living skills and may require additional training or instruction. So I always push for independent living to be considered both in assessment and in goal areas. And again, those annual goals are written to help the student make progress towards their measurable post-secondary goals. They tell us what the student's going to do in the next 12 months to move in that direction. These goals should not be repeated year over year. If goals are being repeated, that's a huge red flag. What is wrong with my IEP, my child's IEP, that they're not making progress on their goals? So what is it? Are the goals written poorly? Are they not achieved? Are they not realistic goals? Are there not enough services or interventions in place to help the student meet those goals? Are they being administered in the wrong setting? Like it's too loud in the setting where they're trying to work on the goal, or they're not working on it enough. They're working on it infrequently and therefore there's no progress. Whatever it is, you should be aware of. You, students and parents, should be involved in developing these goals. Get your students buy-in as much as possible. Here's just a simple formula. This is from the National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center, or NSTTAC, which is a great resource for some of the things we're talking about today. The difference between the post-secondary and the annual goal formula. Possible goal areas, there could be a zillion goals tied to those measurable post-secondary goals. It's going to be very unique to each child. You can have more than one annual goal tied to each area, each measurable post-secondary goal. So what I see is for the post-secondary goals, teams want to write one goal in each area. And if you ask for more, they say, oh no, we only have room for one. Well, too bad. My son has more than one post-secondary goal in each area. We need to write 2, 3, 4, 5 goals in each area, as long as it's reasonable, right? It can't be so wild, like, you know, one of them is, I want to work as a barista at Starbucks, and the other one is, I want to be king of the world. You know, they have to be realistic. They have to still be SMART goals. And then there can be multiple annual goals tied to each measurable post-secondary goal. And there might be annual goals that work on all 3 or work on 2 areas. And you want to actually reference in the measurable post-secondary goal, the annual goal that is tied to that area, so that there's a direct connection in the IEP. You want to be thinking about what their specific needs are. If the student has multiple goals, they might need goals in academics and self-advocacy and health. They might need goals in, independent living. They might need travel training goals. They might need executive functioning goals, whatever it is. Again, each child is unique. I don't know your student, so you're going to have to work with the IEP team to determine what are the appropriate goals. The other thing we have to consider is that if the student has a health condition, it's really important to have goals in many areas to address their health needs. I mentioned that I'm going to do a power hour later this year on health transition, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but the IEP team should consider including as much self-care and independent management of health conditions as possible to optimize independence in adulthood education, employment, living, and community settings. So they have to be able to manage their own health conditions. They have to understand the nuts and bolts of the health system. They have to be able to make healthy choices in daily life, understanding what's a healthy diet, et cetera. And then they have to consider health and employment, right? How much stamina do I have to be on the job, at all of those things. There is a code in the IEP, which I just learned, and I'm not going to give you the number because it's going to be different in every district, but there's a specific service code for training for students with diabetes. And I would argue that any student with any health condition that needs training in their IEP could be put under that service code. So you can just ask your team, is there a service code for student training for diabetes? And what is that? And let's discuss how that could be applied to my child's health needs, because they need to learn about so many things before they leave. Imagine your student is going to college and they still have epilepsy medicine that they're taking, medications, and they get to college and they don't understand the impact of not sleeping on their epilepsy and their medications. What about missing a dose? What about not transferring their medication or establishing neurology care locally so that if they have a problem with their medications, they can't get it in a timely manner? What about contraindications with birth control medication or recreational medication or other prescribed medications, right? So all of these things are things that could become a major emergency, a major healthcare situation for this individual in college or in adult life. So they really need to be practicing and learning about this while they're still in high school. I'm actually speaking this week at the National Association of School Nurses to talk about the legal requirements for students with epilepsy in IEP plans, and this is something I will be discussing. This is just a really fun checklist. This is actually from a California school district that's just essential life skills for all teens. Again, this was in the packet I sent to you for all of you who registered. You can email me at avernick@epilepsysurgeryalliance.org if you want to receive this. I just really love this slide. All of these areas are areas that you should be considering in your child's IEP. Now we've gotten through all of that, we're going to detail the transition services that the student will receive to support achieving their IEP goals. Without the appropriate transition services, the student might not be able to translate their education to successful post-secondary life. We really need services that teach the students with disabilities life and work skills while they are still in school. So consider what their post-school activities will be. They might be going into post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment. They might have adult services. They might be in independent living or looking at community instruction or community activities. So what are the services that are going to help the student move into their adult life and reach their annual goals? If there's one slide in the slide deck I want you to print out, it's this one. This is the language to use when you're in your IEP meeting and you're discussing your child's transition services in the IEP, because the law says that transition services are a coordinated set of activities for a student with a disability that is designed to be within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the student with a disability to facilitate the student's movement from school to post-school activities. So activities need to be coordinated with each other. So if you're talking about your child's service plan, there's services that will be provided in their IEP for transition, and it just looks like it's very disjointed or there's no continuity or doesn't make sense to you, can say to the team, how are these activities coordinated? How is this a coordinated set of activities? How is this process focusing on results for my student? If they're not addressing both academic and functional, you can share this 300.43 right out of IDEA. The services, transition services have to be focused on improving the academic and functional achievement. So again, students get stuck in life skills class and they're going to stop teaching literacy. Well, that's not what the law says. The law says the transition services are focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the student. And the purpose of all of this is to smooth their transition into the post-school world. So this is the language that you want to have ingrained in your head. So here's an example of a coordinated set of activities or some activities you could consider. So instruction. So this could be specially designed instruction or special education. It could be the course of study, like your child wants to go to college. Maybe they need to take AP courses to go into the college that they want to go into. And maybe they need a tutor or some school-based supports to do that course. That would be part of the IEP. And there can be other instruction needs, right? So there's not a limit. It's in this realm. What are the related services they're going to need in order to approach their transition goals, to reach their transition goals? What about community experiences? I've talked a lot about situational assessment, situational experience. So we really know what settings are they thriving in and which ones are not working. Are we working on employment objectives? A lot of times schools will like to say, well, the vocational rehabilitation department will take care of that, but they don't. They're in school 5 days a week. The law says that this is part of the transition services that have to be provided by the school. So don't let them back out of this responsibility. What are their post-school adult living objectives that they can start working on now? What are the daily living skills that they need to be working on? I have if appropriate here because that's what the law says, but I think it's always appropriate for any student with an IEP to have daily living skills objectives. And then again, that functional vocational evaluation. We really want to be considering what activities help them explore their futures and develop skills. Which specific services they'll receive is determined by the IEP team, which now includes the parent and the student, right? The parent was always included, but the student now needs to be part of that. And it's intended to ensure that the student with the IEP can successfully transition into the wider world. So it's not just providing coursework, but it's providing training in real world skills. And when you think about a child that's more cognitively impaired or functionally impaired, you can still explore employment. You have to think about what that's going to look like. So there are things like, is it paid? Does that matter, right? So for some individuals, it doesn't matter if it's paid. It matters more, is it a worthwhile experience for them? Is it linked to an activity that the student already enjoys? Is it relevant to the student? Does the student already have the functional ability to do this skill that they would need, or can they develop it? Is it interesting to the person that will support them, right? Is it an activity where we're going to be able to find support people to help them with that? Because that can be a lifelong ongoing need to have support staff. What are their needs and challenges that we can support now? And considering what is possible with support rather than just saying this student will never achieve independent employment, right? That's fine, but what could they do with support? These are some things to consider. And for the student that is more complex and severe, we're going to be using tools like person-centered planning. We need robust communication between home and school. Parents really need to understand what is happening in the progress of these transition goals and services so they know where they need to fill in the gaps. Are we using self-determination or supported self-determination? Are we providing instruction in many settings? Because remember, consider a student with just a behavior issue. Maybe they do fine in Miss Jones's class, right? But then they're going to go to an adult setting, an adult day program, or the YMCA, or horseback riding, or riding public transit, and they fall apart, right? So we need to start practicing in many different settings the skills they will need. We really need to focus on the needed skills, but also presume competence, presume that they are capable of mastering this with the right instruction and the right practice. When we think about combining the transition and the IEP requirements, one thing I need to add this to the slide is I often talk about a letter of parent concerns when I talk about the IEP process in general and how you need to write your letter of parent concerns before every IEP meeting. I think at transition age, you're writing a vision statement. You and the student are sitting down together and writing the statement of the student's hopes and dreams for the future. And you're going to identify, the parent and the student are going to identify, these are my strengths, these are my needs, these are my interests, these are the preferences. This is what the law says. Students stated strengths, needs, interests, and preferences, including their career goals. And they might not know exactly what they want, and that's okay, because we're going to do this every year, annual transition assessment, right? So we get to revisit this and if things change. All of the requirements of a regular IEP are the same, except for now we have that the transition requirements that are added, the annual transition assessment, inviting outside agencies, the student must be attending the meeting, etc. At the end of the day, while transition services are coordinated between the school and outside agencies, or they should be, if an outside agency promises to do something for your child and they fail to do it, the school district is ultimately responsible for meeting that need if it is written in the student's IEP, right? So you want to bring everyone to the table, write everything in the IEP, and maybe it's vocational rehabilitation is going to provide a 6-week training course on baking skills for Susie. And then, oh, sorry, we don't have a baking class. Oh, sorry, no opening. Sorry, no teacher. Oh, now the class is full and a year goes by. You go back to your IEP team and you say you need to provide this course because it's not happening through that outside agency. You don't even need to let a year go by, right? But I see this all the time where outside agencies will promise things, then they don't have the staffing. The law says that at the end of the day, the school district is the one left holding the bag, right? They are the ones that are responsible to make sure the services occur. Progress monitoring is always essential. It's so important at transition age. And I said in the previous hour last week that we want to stop at transition age. We're overwhelmed with IEPs. We're like, oh, I just want to be done with this process. But it's really, really important that you're very invested in this and that you're monitoring what's happening, that you're understanding the progress your student is making, that you're regularly informed of progress with consistent data, that you call an IEP anytime you have a question that isn't being addressed by your IEP team, or you have a concern or a new evaluation is needed or anything, you can call an IEP meeting at any time. The school district has 30 days in which to hold that meeting once you make a formal request. The school district is obligated to implement an appropriate and meaningful transition plan for each child with a disability. So the only way that's going to happen is if you follow up regularly, if you call those IEP meetings, if you're checking in with the team about how's progress going, right? It's not going to happen on its own. So now that transition assessment is updated annually, and then the IEP is updated based on that transition assessment. So what is the age appropriate transition assessment? Does that mean every year you're repeating every evaluation? My son has like 20 evaluations. No, probably not, right? So, but there might be a few things that you want to repeat every year to see if progress is being made in those areas. It might be a comprehensive evaluation of every area every year, if that's what's warranted, right? So it's going to depend on the IEP team, because the IDEA calls for age-appropriate transition assessment. And then you are going to update the present levels based on those current assessments. You're going to review the progress on the annual goals and update the post-secondary goals. You're going to review the course of study. Oh, actually now, my son has changed his goal from being environmental studies, and now he wants to go in recreation therapy. So now he actually needs to take this AP class so he can get into that program. So let's add that to his course of study. Oh, that means he's not going to be able to graduate. Great. Let's do a summer class. I want you to pay for that, right? So we can make sure we get that in his high school year. So you're really thinking about what does he need based on his stated post-secondary goal, and the district is obligated to provide that. You want to make sure those transition activities are taking place. Don't wait for the annual to do that, but make sure at that time, make sure that the linkages with the outside agencies are solid, make sure they're invited to every annual IEP meeting, that they really understand, those outside agencies really understand what they are providing, what the district is providing, who's paying for what, and revise that plan. At the age of majority, this is the legal age established by state law when a person is no longer a minor. In most states, this is age 18. At this age, your child will have control over and responsibility for their own educational, medical, financial, and other legal decisions and actions, whether or not they are ready for this responsibility. So depending on your state's regulations, many rights as a legal guardian automatically transfer over to the student. The school district is obligated to notify you of this transition 1 year before it happens. This is part of why students should be invited to every IEP meeting. It's their lives. We want to make sure they understand that adulthood is approaching. We want to make sure they understand what changes are going to happen once they turn 18. Very, very important that we include the primary stakeholder in all of these conversations about decision making. In the interest of time today, I'm not going to spend time on this slide. We're going to talk about this when we talk about future planning, but just know there are a variety of decision-making tools that can be used, and there's a variety of healthcare decision-making tools that can be used, which I will cover in future power hours. Lastly, now we're at graduation and aging out. So graduating with a regular high school diploma or aging out of a transition program is a change in educational placement. It requires an IEP team meeting and written notice via a summary of performance. The IEP team, which includes the parent and the student, reviews the comprehensive transition goals and will decide whether or not the student is ready to graduate. So it's not, oh, he's got the diploma, he's done, although I see this happen all the time. If the law says that the transition aids, those services must be focused on improving academic and functional achievement. So if the goals and services aren't successfully designed to address both, or only one was addressed, I often will see just academic or just functional, then you want to go back to the IEP team, or you want to consult with a special education advocate or attorney. That summary of performance is required for students exiting high school with a regular diploma or aging out. It has to be specific, meaningful, and easily understood. It should include a summary of what is their academic achievement, what is their functional performance, and it must include recommendations. Not every school does this well. Schools are not required to conduct new assessments or evaluations in order to provide this summary, but the information in this summary should include documentation of the student's disability, which might be needed to access to adult services or accommodations in college. So if you have a 3-year-old neuropsych eval or psychoeducational evaluation or evaluation that determines their disability, and a new evaluation might be needed at this time in order for them to access those adult services, you can ask the school to provide that. If the school district attempts to exit your child from special education services before graduation, which I see a lot, where the child's in high school and they try to tell the parent, your kid doesn't really need an IEP. Let's just get rid of this thing. They're required to evaluate the student in all areas of suspected disability, and the evaluations determine whether or not that child is exited from an IEP or not the school. The school doesn't just say, whoop, it's gone, it's magic, right? It has to be, the assessments have to be done. Failure to provide transition services has consistently been viewed as a violation of the substantive requirement of IDEA. The process must focus on results. So including the language of the law is not enough. There are many different examples of case law that discuss this that I can send you links for. We have some links at the end of the presentation. So when your child graduates, they're going to graduate with a regular diploma or a certificate of completion. You can refuse the diploma if the student did not meet their goals or were not provided with an appropriate IEP, and ask the school to provide additional services until they graduate. They may have that alternate diploma or certificate of completion, which means they stay in a transition program provided by the school district through age 22. In some states, it's up to age 26. So really look at your state law. And then transition programs, school districts must provide transition services, but what they often provide are transition programs. And those programs are one size fits all. They often are not appropriate for most students. They fit a very small subset of students. So if there is a transition program that is being offered, remember the law says transition services must be provided. They are not required to be done in the program that the district has. If the cookie cutter program does not work for your child, get back to that IEP table and say, this is not going to work. We need a different program. For students who are on a diploma track, sometimes they have such great functional needs that it might be better to reject the diploma or get off the diploma track, and to get those extra 6 years of transition programming to work on those functional skills, and then go into a community college or approach further education that way. That's another strategy I've seen some families use. I just said this, the one size fits all and check the box is not going to effectively prepare students with disabilities for transition. There are many issues at graduation and aging out. I'm just going to look here and see how many slides I have left, because I think I'm really going to go over. I just have a few more. Okay. If the child doesn't graduate with so at age 18, if they've earned a diploma, a regular diploma in your state, and they're 18, they are done with FAPE. No more FAPE. It's gone. That's what the law says. So it's up to you as a parent to be looking at that child's IEP, progress on goals, were the functional needs addressed, were the academic needs addressed before they turn 18, because they may earn the diploma from the school and be 18, but not have met all those other things, and you can then reject the diploma. If they haven't earned a diploma at 18, they continue in transition program. If the transition program is not appropriate, you need to find an appropriate transition program or service. If the outside services or programs were not provided, the school district needs to provide that. A couple of things that I see often, students with significant disabilities may be excluded from programs at the high school, right? So the high school might have a career club. Well, that sounds great. Oh no, that's only for the general education students. Your student can't go there. Well, why not? The student is a student first. So is there an accommodation? Is there a support? Is there a way that student could participate in career club, right? And learn about the things that they're interested in. Students on a diploma track, on the other hand, might have their non-academic needs ignored. So the student's working on a diploma, but they really have functional needs. And there's maybe a program at the school for the students that have more functional needs. And they say, no, 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 no. Your student's on a diploma track. They can't access that program. Why not? That's not what the law says. Earning a diploma is not enough. They need to work on both because they need to access the academic skills so they can make their own decisions. We don't want them to leave high school thinking they are prepared when they are not. Graduation is just the beginning. Please don't wait to start planning. Evaluations are key. Those annual goals and the measurable post-secondary goals have to be student-centered. It's better if they're student-driven. The more buy-in, the better. There need to be goals and services in employment, further education, and independent living always, in my opinion. That plan needs to be based on the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. The outside agencies are critical because they're going to provide those ongoing services. One thing I will say is that after your child ages out of the IDEA, right, either at age 18 with a diploma or age 22 to 26 aging out of their transition program, a lot of the things we discussed today are things you can still be working on with your child. My son, who's 19, I'm still working on a lot of things that need to be worked on here. The adult world is very siloed. There are many different laws and a lot of interplay between all of those laws that can be complicated. It's kind of like learning a new process all over again. There's a lot of paperwork, which means there's a lot of headaches. I'm still doing very much supported adulthood for my son. Yes, he's in college, but he needs tons and tons and tons of support to manage his rights, his services, his education, his social skills, all of that. So then some things to think about as you're going through this process is, does your school district know how to guide you in this process? When I give this presentation live and I ask this question, there's often kind of a rumble of chuckle in the room. Because what I see is that parents will their child will be 16. I'll do this presentation and they'll raise their hand and say, my child is 16 and no one's ever mentioned this to me. No one's ever talked to me about the obligations of the district at transition age, right? Or my child's 18 and just graduated, but they can't actually read, or they can't find their way out of the bathroom at a restaurant, or they can't socialize with other people, or they have no behavior skills, right? So if you don't feel like you have the supports in your current school setting, can you access those other supports in another way? Can you reach out to a local agency? Every state, there's a National Transition Alliance. There's many different transition organizations. Many of them are listed in our guide. We have a 100-page guide on transition. We also have a free course on transition that has a lot of these resources in there. So see if you can find some additional resources to support you. I'm happy to answer any questions. I just want to remind everyone I'm still recording. So if you'd like to ask a question and not be saved forever on our YouTube channel, you can put it in the chat, or you can wait a few minutes until I stop the recording. Thank you all for being here today.